Nancy, thank you, and welcome to all of you to our colloquium today. To give you a preview of the upcoming colloquia, in March we will be hosting Tom Prieslak, who is the head of the Cedars-Sinai Health System, who will be discussing the future of American medicine. In May, Lynn Vavrick, who is a professor of political science at UCLA, who will be talking about electoral politics. In September, Kathleen McChesney, a former FBI agent who was involved in the investigation of the clergy abuse scandal, will be speaking with us. And in October, Roberto Suro, who is a professor of political science at USC, will be talking about American immigration policy. And I'll just make a request for those of you who will be asking questions during the Q&A at the end of the speech today, please stand up so that our speaker could see where you are and to be able to better handle that part of our program. I cannot think of a topic that is more timely, more urgent than the topic about which we're going to be hearing today. North Korea is in the news on a daily basis. It's been in the news on a daily basis for months, and even now, today, probably even more urgent than in prior times. Our speaker today is Bruce Bennett, who is a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation, who works primarily on research topics such as strategy, force planning, and counterproliferation within the RAND International Security and Defense Policy Center and the RAND Arroyo Strategy, Doctrine, and Resources Program. Dr. Bennett specializes in what he terms as asymmetric threats, such as weapons of mass destruction, and how to counter those threats with new strategies, operational concepts, and technologies. Dr. Bennett is an expert on Northeast Asian military issues, having visited the region more than 110 times and written much about North Korean security issues. He has also done work on the Persian and Arab Gulf regions. Dr. Bennett received his BS degree in economics from CalTech and his PhD in policy analysis from the Pardee Rand Graduate School. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Bennett.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk with you a little bit about what's been going on in Korea. And I'm sure Korea's captured many people's attention in the recent past, not just because of the Olympics, but heavily because of missile and nuclear weapon tests and other provocations. It's a very interesting period of time. It's also interesting because it's not quite clear where we're going, what our government is going to be doing to try to bring this together. So I'll talk about some of the possibilities and hopefully whet your attention. Let's look at what the history has been here. We look out over the last couple of decades. North Korea did its first missile test, the number of missiles, in 1984. These were short-range Scud missiles, about a 300-kilometer range, and some worked and some didn't work, but they didn't do a whole lot of testing. During the period of Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, they did a little bit of testing during his father's period, mainly in two time frames, 2006 and 2009, when they also did nuclear tests, the big red explosions there. But then when you transition to the new leader, Kim Jongun, he's taken a very different path. Very active in missile tests, much more active in nuclear tests, and as we'll discuss, there have been a whole lot of politics going on under them. What kind of thing do I mean? In North Korea, you do your State of the Union speech on January 1st. And in his January 1st, 2017 speech, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, said in 2017 he was going to test an ICBM. President-elect Trump at the time said the very next day in a tweet, "It won't happen." Now, culturally, put yourself in the position of Kim Jong-un, the wannabe god of North Korea. When Kim Jong-un said it won't happen, that was a challenge. I'm sorry, President Trump. Yes, my apologies. President Trump said that it was a challenge. So soon thereafter, he starts responding verbally to the challenge, saying, I can do this anywhere, anytime. And then in February, he tests a new missile, which he claims is the first stage of his eventual ICBM. It flies over Japan, which is a new development. And it's a solid fuel missile. Liquid fuel missiles have to be stood up and fueled before they can be launched, so it takes time, and they could be shot at during that time. Solid fuel missile is raised up and immediately launched. You don't have much time to respond, if any. And so this was a new technology. And a couple of days later, the North Koreans claim, hey, President Trump isn't even trying to stop us. He doesn't even have a strategy. It's kind of at the level of the nya, 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 nya kind of approach from North Korea. Now, this was not just a missile test time frame, though. The day after that missile firing, the North Koreans killed the older half-brother of Kim Jong-un. The older half-brother was in Malaysia in the airport, and he is killed using a banned chemical agent called VX. Now, VX is particularly lethal. It's like oil, so it doesn't create vapor, but roughly 1/10 of a drop on your cheek will kill you. That's how poisonous it is. But on the other hand, it takes 25 times as much on the palm of your hand to kill you. So the women had some on the palm of their hands, they touch his cheeks, they walk away and wash their hands. It is water soluble, and they only show some symptoms, and he's dead in half an hour. Now, this is interesting because you have to ask, so why do it this way? Well, death by VX looks very much like a heart attack. The North Korean ambassador's car was at the hospital where his body was delivered. He was there in Malaysia on a North Korean passport. And the North Koreans showed up at the hospital and said, you have one of our diplomats, we want his body now. He died of a heart attack. Fortunately, the Malaysians were smart enough to give in to that and did their own investigation and discovered it was a chemical weapon that killed him. But if they had succeeded, they might have spirited away the body and nobody would have ever known that he died of anything other than natural causes. So this was a pretty clever program they put together where you could use a chemical agent in that way. But it had an interesting byproduct. What if they failed, which they did? Well, then it announces to the world that they have VX, they're prepared to use it, and in particular, if you're a defector from North Korea, you better keep your mouth shut, or you could be next. So this is a big coercive tool. Now, in the world, this was not a very popular action by North Korea. In particular, the Chinese had told Kim Jong-un, you lay off your older brother, don't you dare hurt him. And he normally lived in Macau, a part of China where the Chinese protected him. So North Korea arranges him to be killed when he's in another country, and the Chinese are furious. What do? 6 days later, they implement a coal import cutoff. Now you might say, wait a minute, what's the big deal about cutting off coal imports? In 2016, coal was 40% of North Korea's exports financially. 40% of the hard currency they brought in, and almost all of that went to China. So this was a huge financial hit on North Korea. Now, the North Koreans aren't particularly inclined to say, oh, well, you did it to us. Okay, I guess we just have to live with it. No, they did their standard response. A couple weeks later, after they have some time to prepare, they launch 4 Scud missiles from North Korea on a missile test. These are missiles now with a 1,000-kilometer range. And what do? They say, We are furious at the U.S. and South Korea. They're about to start an exercise, which is the one that's been postponed this year. This was in March of last year. And they're preparing to invade us, so we're striking back at this exercise. Well, which might make some sense, except the missiles that they launched were fired on that arc of 1,000 kilometers up in the Japanese exclusive economic zone. They were fired at Japan. Now, they went into the water, but they went into the Japanese exclusive economic zone. And you might say, wait a minute, you're furious at South Korea and the U.S. Why are you shooting at Japan? And their response to that kind of question was, well, we're firing as if we were firing at the American military bases in Japan. So I put the 6 major air bases that the U.S. uses in Japan on the map, and what you'll notice is a missile with that range launched from that location could only cover one of the 6. In fact, they'd have to be much longer range to cover the others. So you go, there's something screwy going on here. And there was, I think, and here's what it is, I would argue. If you take that same range ring and run it in the other direction, it covers half of the biggest Chinese cities. From Shanghai down here to Beijing, up to the cities north of North Korea, it covers a lot of the Chinese population. Now, the North Koreans usually don't criticize China. Now, one of the myths we hear in our country is China and North Korea are close allies from the 1950s. Not. They are not close allies. They don't like each other. In fact, when Kim Jongun came into office, according to some of the defectors I have talked to, he ordered his military that they were to have nothing to do with the Chinese military. No talking of planning, of training, no planning together, no exercising together, nothing. They don't like each other. But normally, North Korea does not directly criticize China. They know that's not a particularly good thing to do. But by firing missiles that could have covered major Chinese cities, they're basically telling China, yeah, we could have clobbered you too if we'd wanted to. So back off. Don't be so stern with us. Back off. Which reflects the North Korean culture of juche, self-reliance, heavily nationalistic. We can handle anybody, even the Chinese. Again, probably not, almost certainly not, but the way they would approach things. So what do we make from this? Well, about the same time as all of this is happening, the Chinese then make a proposal called Freeze for Freeze. It had actually been made by the North Koreans earlier. It said, the Americans are seriously distressed by the North Korean nuclear and missile tests. So China proposed that North Korea stop those and the U.S. and South Korea stop our military exercises. And to many people, that seems very reasonable, until you get into the details. One detail it misses is North Korea does a major military exercise every year from December through March. It is their winter training exercise. If they were going to invade South Korea, the ideal time would be at the end of their training exercise. Their troops would be most ready to go. In March, the ground is still frozen in Korea, but the temperature is much warmer than in February. So the U.S. and South Korea always does an exercise in March, so we are better prepared in case the North decides to come south in that time frame. And China wants us not to hold our exercise, but doesn't tell North Korea not to do their winter training. Nor does China say, and we will stop our training to go militarily into North Korea as well. And even in the media, there have been many stories in the last couple of years that the Chinese army has been exercising to go into North Korea. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, has been saying, I will not allow war or chaos to develop on the peninsula. Okay, here's a Chinese leader who can't stop North Korea from testing ballistic missiles. How's he going to stop war or chaos? Unless it's with boots on the ground. And that is what his troops have been preparing for. And he's not going to stop that, but the U.S. and South Korea are supposed to stop our exercises. Obviously a biased proposal. Our people in Washington are really quite smart enough to catch that and did not agree to it. But what does that mean? Okay, well, so last year, after the missile test in February, North Korea does 3 failed missile launches, not consistent with much of their pattern in recent past. And then it turns to May, and they launch 3 different new missiles, and all of them work. Now that raises some interesting questions, because last year, the previous year in 2016, North Korea's most advanced missile, the Musudan, was tested 8 times. It failed 7 of the 8 times. So when they're on that cusp of new technology, looks like they often have problems, and yet they succeeded every time. And it makes you quickly ask, whose help were they getting? And it's pretty likely, in fact, we can pretty well document that it was Russian help. Whether it's Russian government help or just Russian scientists, we don't know. But we know there are Russian scientists in North Korea. So you look at that as the backdrop. Then in July, they test 2 ICBMs, and I'll talk about those more in a minute. Then we come to the big U.S. and South Korea summer training exercise. And what does North Korea do? Standard coercion. U.S., South Korea, don't do your exercise. If you do, then we're going to fire a bunch of missiles and nuclear weapons. And of course we say, no, we're not accepting the freeze for freeze. So what does North Korea do? First week of the exercise, they launch a bunch of Scud missiles, short range. Then they launch a couple missiles over Japan, and they also do a very big nuclear test. So they're trying to be coercive and say, see, you should have canceled your exercise, and then we wouldn't have had to do our tests. Or then again, they might have anyway. You never know. Okay, what about that nuclear test? Nuclear tests are measured in terms of yield. How big is the explosion? The Hiroshima blast was about 10 kilotons. Now that means 10,000 tons of TNT. Not 10 pounds of TNT, 10,000 tons of TNT equivalent. That's a huge explosion. North Korea's tests are shown here. The first test, probably 1 kiloton. They go up to 2 or 3, then they go up to 6 or 8. Their 4th test a little bit worse. They didn't seem to do very well. Their 5th test up around 15 kilotons, more in the Hiroshima-Nagasaki range. And then their 6th test goes up to 150 kilotons, or some argue it was 250. A much bigger explosion. And I'll show you in a minute what difference that makes. Meanwhile, it's also important to note the time between these exercises, and I'm sorry the bottom got cut off, 31 months in between the first and second, then 45 months, then 35, and now 8 months and 12 months. So, after the Olympics are over, and North Korea got everything they could have dreamed of at the Olympics, to a lot of South Koreans' absolute anger and hatred of the current South Korean president, which we could talk about. But after that, we're going to do our winter training or our spring training exercise. So what's North Korea going to do in March and April this year? Likely just what they did in August last year. We could see more missile tests and another nuclear test. We don't know. They haven't announced it yet. But it may be coming. Now, what difference does it make? This is a map of downtown Seoul you'll notice up here, close to the presidential residence as a target, I've laid down a 10-kiloton weapon, Hiroshima-sized weapon. You'll notice that the damage, numbered dead, numbered injured, are really, really big. These are huge numbers. Now, just add those two numbers together, the total people affected, and this isn't glass cuts or that sort of thing. These are people showing very clear radiation injury. The hospital capacity in all of South Korea is roughly that total number. So what do you do if you have that many people affected? Then, on the other hand, if it's really a 250 kiloton test or explosion, those are the numbers. Those are incredibly large. Just very, very big. Now, the total population of the Seoul metropolitan area, the immediate area, 10 million, the broader area, about 25. So it's not half of the population, but it is still a very, very big number. Now, not to be forgotten, North Korea also has chemical and biological weapons. You'll see there, the fatalities are much bigger range, much more uncertainty, because these weapons are carried by the wind and therefore depend dramatically upon the wind speed, its direction, and the atmospheric conditions. But notice that the lower end of those numbers look like what? 9/11, don't they? And the high end, many times that. Now, a lot of people would say, well, yeah, but how do you ever get a ton of chemical weapons into Seoul from North Korea? Well, it's really very simple. North Korea has a multiple rocket launcher. It's a truck which carries launcher for rockets. Standard truck has 22 rockets on board. 6 of those trucks make one battery. One battery can put down 2.5 tons of chemicals. And there are only about 30 of those batteries within range of Seoul. So these numbers are small potatoes compared to what they could do if we wound up in a full war. All of these numbers are very illustrative of why people have been extraordinarily careful about not getting into a big war in Korea, and why even our current government, while they're trying to coerce the North Koreans, are being very careful about any kind of military operation. Now, the final piece. How does North Korea feel about all of this? In 1993, we had the very first nuclear crisis with North Korea. And let me step out so you can read the words. Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, called together his senior generals. And he asked them, if we have to fight the Americans, can we win? You know, remember the nature of the society? Their response was, yeah, we're going to win. But he then threw them a curve and said, but if we lose, what do we do? The military guys were all smart enough to know that was a really good time to keep their mouths shut. But his son, the father of the current leader, Kim Jong-il, spoke up and said, if we lose, I will be sure to destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? Now, he's not going to destroy the earth with rifles and tanks. Not even really going to destroy the earth with nuclear weapons and contagious biological weapons. But he could do a whole lot of damage. And now think about it from the Chinese perspective. He did not say, I will destroy South Korea. He said the earth. He did not exclude China. And this statement, according to defectors, is posted in many prominent places in Pyongyang. So it's a part of the North Korean philosophy. All right, I talked about ICBM tests this last summer. The very first test on July 4th appeared to have about a 6,500 kilometer range. They shot it almost straight up in the air and then down. But if they had shot it on a regular trajectory, it could have covered most of Alaska. Now, this is by definition an ICBM. In the missile community, any missile with a range more than 5,500 kilometers is an ICBM. So even though 6,500 kilometers wouldn't have reached the continental United States, it was still an ICBM. Then in late July, they fire a missile which is more like about a 9,000 kilometer range. And a lot of people would say, well, it looks like that could have gotten to the continental United States. Except as best we can tell, the warhead on that missile was probably only 200 to 300 kilograms, about 500 pounds, about half the size of a likely North Korean nuclear weapon. So yes, they could get that rocket to the US, but not likely with a North Korean nuclear weapon. Then they put one down in November that's more like an 11,000 kilometer range with a really big warhead. And now it appears that they can threaten pretty much anywhere in the US. The difference between these missiles, the second one had 2 of the same size engines that the first one did, mounted side by side, so a much bigger rocket. And so it has longer range. So that's what they're threatening us with. Now, what are they trying to do? Many of you will remember during the Cold War, in the early part of the 1950s, the US still had most of the nuclear weapons in the world, but quickly the Russians start building nuclear weapons, and we faced a major problem. We were worried that the Russians might try to cross into West Germany with their tanks and soldiers, and they had conventional force superiority, considerable numerical superiority over NATO, and we were worried that they could just keep going in through Germany, into France, down to Spain, and so we planned to stop them with tactical nuclear weapons. And for most people, you get to the stage of an exercise with tactical nuclear weapons and you say, see, we stopped them, it's all good. But some of the experts said, wait a minute, if we hit their troops with nuclear weapons, they're likely going to fire nuclear weapons at the US. And eventually, when Charles de Gaulle became the president of France, he said, I don't think the Americans are prepared to trade New York for Paris. Maybe they won't use nuclear weapons to stop the Russians' attack. And so he decided he needed to have his own nuclear weapons and to break out of the NATO military alliance. North Korea is trying to do something similar. It's called decoupling. What they're trying to do is now to convince the US that they can hit our cities. Are we prepared to trade San Francisco for Seoul? Or should we abandon South Korea to North Korea? Let it have all of South Korea, either by conquest or by coercion. That'll be an important question for many of us, but certainly for the generation of our children. So what is Kim Jong-un after? Well, historically people have said, well, he could be interested in regime survival, just surviving himself, or he could be interested in survival and unification. And when I say unification, which he spoke about in his New Year's Day address this year, mentioned it 12 times, he's not talking about what we would think about as Korean unification. He's talking about unification where he also becomes the god of South Korea, where he controls people in South Korea. And as he said when protesters in South Korea burned his picture, North Korean government says those people should be thrown in prison and treated with the utmost action by the courts. As a right of free speech? Well, not in North Korea, and not in his vision of a unified Korea. So what does that mean? Well, if he's only interested in regime survival, he's got enough nuclear weapons to convince people that attacking him is not a good idea. But if he wants to unify the country under his control, he's going to need more. We're going to see more tests of nuclear weapons and of missiles. So when we see those this coming year, you can be sure that it's this latter he's shooting for and not just his survival. All right, so let's talk about deterrence. How does deterrence work? With deterrence, an adversary has benefits he hopes to gain: control of South Korea, costs he would suffer in doing that, destruction of his regime perhaps. If he sees more benefits than more costs, he's not going to be deterred. If he sees more costs than benefits, he probably will be. So he's looking at this situation, probably hoping the benefits will be greater than the costs. And what we've been trying to do is to undermine his benefits. Kill chain, South Korean concept for destroying his missiles and nuclear weapons. We want to locate all those things. He hides most of his facilities. He even has underground airfields in North Korea, among his 10,000 or so underground facilities. Yeah, the plane taxis and runs down, and when it's ready to take off, it emerges from the underground facility and leaves the ground. So North Korea buries a lot of things because they know we can do a lot of bombing. We need to find missile defenses that will be effective against him, and we've got to protect our forces. But he's not letting the game play simply. He's prepared to hide his assets. He's prepared to build more nuclear weapons to undermine our defenses. So this is not a static game. This is an activity, this is a Cold War which is going on. You think the Cold War is a history, it is not anymore in Korea. Okay, so where's he headed towards? Well, if he only had 3 nuclear weapons, he's probably holding them for regime survival. But if he gets up into the 50 or 100 or 200 range, there are a much wider range of things he can do, including targeting us. And in his January 1st speech, he was very explicit that that was his objective, that he wants to target the U.S. All right, so how do we rein him in? We've got to stop the development of this nuclear program. Well, unless we're prepared to do it with nuclear weapons or with substantial conventional weapons, then we're driven towards some form of negotiation. And the problem with negotiations with North Korea, their culture is you get the best agreement you can, and then the dumb party lives by the agreement and the smart party cheats as much as it can. And we know that from the history with North Korea. So we're looking at a difficult prospect to do this peacefully. Not impossible, but difficult. We could trade economic sanctions for some form of North Korean program, but his nuclear weapons are extraordinarily important to him, and he's shown us already that sanctions aren't so important because they didn't stop him building nuclear weapons in the first place. So how are we going to go beyond that? Well, we could do the military attacks, but he's spread his nuclear and missile capabilities all around his country as best we know. We don't even know where a lot of that is. So are we talking about weeks of military attacks to take out and try and find where his things are? And how's he going to respond when we start attacking his nuclear weapons? One of the concepts in nuclear deterrence is one called use it or lose it. When the other side starts attacking you, you either use your nuclear weapons or you're going to lose them. And as soon as we start attacking them, he may well conclude it's time to use them. In fact, he has said that he is prepared to preempt any preemption by our side. So he could use nuclear weapons on the very first day of a war. So we can't do a big attack. We could do a surgical strike, but you know, that's kind of like kicking somebody in the knee and hoping that they're going to quit. Most people are going to punch back, and we suspect that's where he would go as well. Other options, well, we could take some non-lethal military actions, but I think the key is really on political or information operations. The former deputy ambassador of North Korea to the UK defected about a year ago, and in November last year he came to the US and testified to Congress. And what he said was really very interesting, I thought. What he basically said was, I don't get you Americans. Why are you always talking about military operations? This regime has got its weaknesses. and information operations would likely be far more effective, far less costly, and far less risky. So what kind of thing am I talking about? Simple example. Remember last year that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, arranged to have his older brother killed when he was in Malaysia in the airport. Talked about that earlier. And since that time, President Trump has put North Korea on the terrorism list. North Korea's media recognized that President Trump did it, but said it was totally without justification. So why don't we respond and say, you know, what part of killing your brother in a foreign airport in a public environment with a banned chemical substance isn't terrorism? Sounds like terrorism to me. But this is one of the kinds of statements that keeps on giving. Because you have to understand that in 2010, when Kim Jong-un was declared the successor in North Korea, he started killing anyone in the elites who even knew his older brother. He wanted no faction supporting his older brother. He eventually kills his uncle and many in his family. There was no faction in North Korea for his older brother last year. This apparently reflects Kim Jong-un's paranoia. I think he was worried that the Chinese were becoming increasingly unhappy with him, and sooner or later they might try to take him out and put his brother in his place. So that's the first thing you get to. Second thing you get to is, as those elites go, he had a brother? Really? Tell me more about this. They're going to discover that the older brother was a legitimate son of Kim Jong-il's wife. Kim Jong-un is a bastard son of Kim Jong-il's mistress. And his mother was born in Japan. In Korea, you can hardly get more toxic until you realize that his mother's father was a Japanese collaborator in World War II. Kim Jong-un is having problems with his deification program, trying to get people to recognize him as a god. And things like this, as they come to recognize them over time, will give him even more trouble. And even if we promise to not say the original statement, this was terrorism, his people are going to keep asking questions and churning on this. And it will hit him hard. But my favorite one is this very last one. North Koreans love South Korean soap operas. They'd rather see that than anything. Why? Because they show a lifestyle they'll never have. And even the elites watch them. So if you think the indoctrination of North Korea is impervious, watching a soap opera in South Korea is a capital offense, and the people still do it all the time. So why don't we make a soap opera on the life and times of Kim Jong-un? Show his food, his wine, his women, his purges, all of which have a very toxic effect on the North Korean people. But I would argue information operations usually take time. In this case, let's tell Kim Jong-un, we're going to make this soap opera, but over the next year we're going to do research to make sure this is as historically accurate as possible. You have 1 year. On February 15th next year, we start making this soap opera. You don't want us to make it, you cut us an agreement on your nuclear program. We need to be coming up with innovative concepts, I would argue, like this. All right, so in conclusion, the U.S. faces a quandary. How do we rein this in? I think there are ways of doing it. There's no simple way, but if we start putting actions together, I think we've got some prospects. North Korea, they will argue that you can't trust the Americans. You can't make an agreement with them. After all, the Americans told Gaddafi to get rid of his weapons of mass destruction program, implied they would take care of him. And then when the rebels rose against Gaddafi, the Americans bomb him and his troops. So obviously the Americans are unreliable. They don't do what they agree to. Well, there is some truth in that story. And unfortunately, it's biting us here. The Chinese, we don't know what the Chinese are going to do. They don't want North Korea to fall because they don't want South Korean and American troops up on their border. But on the other hand, they're getting pretty ticked off with Kim Jongun. We don't know when they're going to cross the path of no return. And South Korea is trying to negotiate with the North, trying to make things better, but not really recognizing the North Korean version of unification. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions. Got a microphone going back there, and then we'll get...
Well, that was fascinating. I'm wondering whether you think Kim Jong-un is a rational actor. It seems like with your actions, counteractions, he might be in many ways, but then you've got this whole wanting to be God of South Korea. So how do you view him in that respect?
Yeah. The first thing to recognize is North Korea tries to prevent us from gaining any knowledge of what he does. And so we don't know how much of what he does is out of passion, moderated by people around him. We just don't know for sure his personality and character. The last track we have on that was when he was in middle school in Europe. And he was known as a pretty poor student, mainly interested in basketball and not with his head in studies. As far as we know, he didn't go to college. He was home taught, which is what happened with his father. So the appearance, though, is North Korea does a pretty rational set of things. Look how many times they've outplayed the Americans over the last decades. You know, getting us to agree to things, and then, you know, who would have said 30 years ago, well, it's okay for North Korea to have 30 or 40 or 50 nuclear weapons. We don't care. Yet that's kind of where we are right now. So he's done some pretty rational things. His rationality is different. He's like a mafia family. He really only cares, from what we can tell, about himself. But on the other hand, there is a rationality to that. So hard to tell. Got a mic over here?
Thanks. Would you explain to me that, what's the half-life of dropping a 200-kiloton bomb in the middle of South Korea?
So if it gets exploded or if it's carried in there by special forces?
Exploded.
Exploded? Yeah. A North Korean weapon like that would probably be delivered by a missile. We'd likely see the missile between 5 and 10 minutes before it actually detonates on its target. That would give us some time to intercept it.
What's the half-life?
Oh, of the radiation?
Yes.
We don't know because we don't know the components.
What would you guess?
Guess is if it's a ground burst, you're going to see so much fallout in the immediate area, it's going to be hard to go back into that area for a while.
What's a while?
You're talking some elements will be years, some elements will be months.
So why would North Korea want to bomb South Korea and destroy the closest thing they have in terms of new country, economics, all the things that it wants to be?
Okay, so this is a difference between our logic and the North Korean logic, I would argue. In the North Korean logic, you take out a few South Korean cities, maybe even Seoul, because you want to prove to the South Koreans that you're more powerful than they, and because you don't really want the chaebols, the big businesses in South Korea, to control the unification. You want to destroy them. You also don't care a lot about people. Back from 1995 to 98, there was a famine in North Korea. The North Koreans allowed roughly 3 million of their public to starve to death. Out of a 20 million population, about 15%, because they had the money to pay for food to import it, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to spend it on other things. So you have to look at it from the North Korean perspective. Would they destroy every South Korean city? Probably not. But they probably wouldn't have to effectively coerce South Korea. We got a question there with the mic?
It's unrealistic to expect them to withdraw their nuclear force because that seems to be one of the problems.
Yeah, they have been very consistent for several years that there is no way they will ever give up their nuclear weapons. They tried to make that very clear because they put in their constitution several years ago that they are a nuclear power. So the question likely, I mean, even though our government still focuses on complete denuclearization, I think getting to zero is very unlikely, and I don't know any experts who think it's likely. So I think the real question is, how do we contain it enough so that we're not constantly under a Cold War with Russia kind of threat? Probably very few of you want to be going out and building the fallout shelter in your backyard again, but we could get there.
Stand up.
Oh, well, I think
military solution is not an option. At least that's what many of our experts, and I remind you, even Steve Bannon said that. It's because it'll result in probably millions, hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths. Isn't the obvious course of action is for our government to reverse its position and to accept North Korea, just as we did accept China when Nixon sent Kissinger, Nixon sent Kissinger in the 60s, the late 60s, with our mortal enemy, who we don't seem to be worrying that China is going to start lobbing nuclear missiles at the United States. Why is North Korea any different, and doesn't it make sense? It's a long way of asking this question. Has anyone in our government realized that one specific practical option is to try to make a deal the same way we did with China and Mao Zedong, who was not really a nice guy either?
Yeah. This turns to a part of deterrence theory which differentiates real deterrence or rational deterrence from cognitive deterrence. Cognitive deterrence talks about an environment where the adversary is in what's called a domain of losses. He's not doing very well, he's worried about his future, and so he tends to become a risk taker. We worry that sooner or later Kim Jong-un may conclude, especially since he's showing a fair degree of paranoia, that his military is rising up against him, which could or could not be true, but he may perceive it, and launch what in the academic literature is called a diversionary war, that he orders them to go south and does the other things with chemical or biological or nuclear weapons that gives him the best chance of winning. Even though he doesn't think he's going to win, he's only got a small probability of that. So we worry that there are cases of his deterrence still being rational within a different framework where we don't constrain him. And that's the problem. Yes, please, over here.
Sorry. What? Thank you. Two questions. One, does China really have control over North Korea? Because I thought that they get most of their coal from China. I know they're getting some from Russia, but what's the deal with that? Can they really control North Korea? And why isn't China more afraid of North Korea? They're right on their border than we are. And my second question is, do Trump's tweets have any impact on our foreign policies? Does it make it worse? Does it make it better?
Yeah. With regard to China, actually, the coal usually goes from North Korea to China. North Korea produces a much better quality coal usually than China does at a lower price. So some of the defectors I've been dealing with, they were actually managing coal exports from North Korea. They would go to China's steel belt down by Shanghai. And the Chinese were very anxious to get the North Korean coal because of its quality and price. Nevertheless, most of the imports to North Korea come from China. China does about, until recently, 85 to 90% of the foreign trade with North Korea. So they're getting Chinese TVs, Chinese cell phones, Chinese computers, all kinds of things like that. China does have some control, especially on the oil that it's sending into North Korea. But China worries that if they push North Korea too hard, North Korea could collapse, the regime could fall apart. And if that happens, they could see a flood of refugees into northeast China. Now, northeast China we normally think of as Manchuria from World War II, the big industrialized part of China. Today it's the Rust Belt of China. It is the poorest economic region in China. They do not want substantial North Korean refugees into that area because it would be destabilizing. They're not going to find jobs. There's an ethnic Korean minority in that area who they could cause to rise up against the Chinese government. So the Chinese are looking for stability. They'll implement the UN sanctions to some extent. And let me draw one analogy. Some people criticize China for allowing leakage of things banned by the UN. How good is our control of the US-Mexico border? Do things occasionally get across that border that we don't want? I mean, trying to stop everything in these kinds of cases, especially when there's no historical pattern of stopping it, is hard. And so we have to watch the judgments we draw here. But the Chinese aren't doing everything they could be doing because they don't want to yet at this stage. But they're moving in the direction where they're pretty angry at North Korea. And I'll stop with that and let some others have a chance. Yes, please.
The state of the interceptor technology in the U.S. and with regard to this conflict, and is further progress painting us into a corner with respect to the ICBM treaty? I'm sorry. Can you tell us about the state of the interceptor technology as it applies to this conflict, all the boost phase intercept and other interceptors? And is this technology putting us into a corner with respect to ICBM treaties?
Okay.
Anti-ballistic missile.
Oh, intercept. So missile interceptors, that sort of thing. The United States has 8 batteries of Patriot missiles in South Korea. The Chinese have many more. They've built a lot of Patriots, and they have the advanced version as well. Then the U.S. put the THAAD missile system in South Korea, which would assist in intercepting. We still don't defend all of the parts of South Korea which are critical. Those systems are designed primarily, especially Patriot, as a terminal system. So it only covers an area around a city usually. So at this stage, we're not covering everything. And the intercept probability is not 100%. You know, we don't get 100% performance on our missiles. We would usually fire 2 Patriots at each incoming missile, probably get 90% or so intercept probability, but some things will still get through. And our total interceptors in Korea, probably about half as many as we would need to take out all of the North Korean missiles. So we're constrained in terms of the capacity of our defenses. We haven't put enough forward. South Koreans are trying to modernize their defenses. They bought hand-me-down German interceptors, Patriots, but they're not designed for missile defense. And they're in the process of trying to upgrade those and go with their own systems. They're a little bit like the North Koreans that like to do their own system. Sir. Oh.
To interchange North Korea. Oh, you seem to interchange North Korea with their leader. To what
With
extent?
what?
With their leader. To what extent is North Korea our threat or the leader? Do we have a Gaddafi here, a Hussein, decapitating, we have a different problem, or is it the entire country that is our threat?
Okay, so to answer that, let me give you my vision of what North Korea... Yeah. As I understood the question, it was about how do we perceive North Korea? Do we perceive it as an absolute enemy, or do we see that there's something other than that that we ought to treat it as?
Decapitate the leader.
Oh, decapitate the leader, sure. Okay. As I look at North Korea, my perception of Kim Jong-un's objective is what he said on January 1st. He wants control of South Korea. Remember that in North Korea, you are indoctrinated that the Americans are your absolute and eternal enemy. In nursery school, you are trained how to bayonet Americans. In fact, he said on January 1st that all of his nuclear weapons were designed for attacking Americans and not Koreans. So trying to placate someone with that philosophy isn't going to work very well. Turn it to the decapitation. Well, decapitation is a possibility we could pursue, but to do that, you have to know where he is. And you'll remember how well we knew where Saddam Hussein was. It took, what, 9 months to find Saddam Hussein? So if we don't know where he is and we start shooting at him, what do you think he's going to do? It's a very dangerous proposition. If we think we've got him, then maybe, but then you've got to ask who takes over after him. Now, there are good news and bad news there. Bad news, it could be a family member, probably not because there's not one positioned, but if it is, they're not likely to be any better than him. The good news is maybe it won't be a family member. Many of the North Korean elites now, who would be the alternative, are capitalists. They learned during the famine of the 1990s that depending upon the regime for everything was stupid, and that you could become a capitalist, and many of them have been. And Kim Jong-un has been put in this very difficult position of how much does he let the markets continue to operate, as opposed to does he rein them in and bring the economy crashing down. And so he's generally let them continue to operate. So you have restaurants and shops in Pyongyang, not because socialism's working, but because capitalism is working. And if you have those alternative leaders as capitalists, and one of them takes over, you probably get more a China-like system. Not ideal, but better than where we are today. And so you kind of got some interesting prospects for the future. Would I want an American to kill him? Absolutely not. I'd be happy to see a North Korean kill him. I'd be happy to induce some North Koreans to kill him. But if an American does it, we're only going to make the culture worse.
What about hacking, electronically hacking their launch systems and their controls?
So so this question was about hacking. Can we hack? Yeah, cyber sorts of things. Can we hack into North Korea? North Korea has what is called an intranet. It does not, generally speaking, connect to the international internet. Very few of their people have access to it. Primarily, they're hackers. Now, their hackers are much larger than we'll usually hear about. My guess is between 20 and 30,000 individuals, many of them in China, though many of those are now moving down to Southeast Asia. But the hackers have access to the international internet. Some of the very senior government leaders do. But most of them are restricted to a North Korean system, and they've developed a fairly sophisticated operating system to monitor what you're looking at on your computer, so they know if you're looking at soap opera DVDs or USBs or whatever. So they're trying to constrain that. We don't really have a lot of access to reach their people, except possibly for some of their most senior people through cyber options. We got over here, please, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have?
So I wanted to ask you, is our tough talk exacerbating the situation? Or is it possible for us to have any diplomatic meeting with the North Koreans to make the situation any better?
So let me give you a historical example to put it into context. Many of you will remember many years ago, a couple of American reporters crossed the border from China into North Korea. When they got in North Korea, they were immediately captured. And eventually, former President Bill Clinton went to North Korea to secure their release. Now that sounds all above board and reasonable, a good thing to do, until you put it into the Korean cultural context. In Korean culture, there is no such thing as a former president. Kim Il-sung is still the president of North Korea, even though he's been dead now for over 20 years. So they looked at Bill Clinton, he's the president of the United States. And in Oriental culture, the weak leader goes to the strong leader to pay his obeisance. So for internal North Korean political purposes, what did they say? See, even the American president had to come to see Kim Jong-il and pay his respects to Kim Jong-il, because he's such a weak leader by comparison to Kim Jong-il. So we have to ask, is that a system we want to buy into, or are we going to look for alternatives? The alternative is you convince the North Koreans that the past history of America is not the history they're seeing now. Past history is we set a red line. We say, don't you dare test a nuclear weapon. And they test a nuclear weapon and we say, oh, well, don't you dare proliferate. And they build a nuclear plant in Syria and we go, oh, well, don't you dare do, and we keep going on. And so they have the impression they can walk all over us. That has changed a little bit with President Trump. Now, be careful, I'm not going to support all of what he said and all of what he's done, but let me give you an example of how it's changed. You remember that he went to the UN General Assembly and talked about Little Rocket Man. And most people found that extremely offensive. It was not a presidential action and so forth. Except it was culturally consistent with North Korea. It's how North Korea operates. In fact, it's not as extreme as North Korea is. If you ever read the North Korean press about Americans and so forth, this was child's play almost. But Kim Jong-un was so offended by what President Trump said that he wrote a personal response. The personal response is interesting because it tells you two important messages in my mind. Number one, he starts out his argument, Kim Jong-un does, by saying, I hadn't expected President Trump to say what he did. I expected him to take the traditional position of American presidents. I was really surprised. Wait a minute, this is the God of North Korea. How could he not know what President Trump was going to say? He's fallible. What an admission for him to make, and to make it in his press so it goes to his people, it goes to people worldwide. Number two, he says almost immediately thereafter, a North Korean, kind of like a proverb or something, he said, a frightened dog barks louder. Now he's talking about President Trump, that President Trump's frightened and so he's barking louder. Except the whole rest of the statement is Kim Jong-un criticizing President Trump and threatening him to convince him not to do things he doesn't want him to do. Kim Jong-un was barking louder. That is probably the first time in my memory that a North Korean leader has been frightened by an American president. Now, look, I mean, there are other things that have been said that I wouldn't put in that kind of category. But sometimes if you want to deal with a rogue leader, you have to take a non-traditional diplomatic approach. I don't know how much of that's a good idea and how much of that is dangerous. We don't know that yet. Hopefully we avoid the dangerous options. Threatening military attacks is a dangerous prospect. If you're going to do that, you better be prepared to follow traditional deterrence theory in how you do it. Hopefully we are. Sir.
Is there any indication that the current U.S. administration is open to think creatively about how we respond to North Korea?
Let me be careful with how I say this. The answer is yes, and I'll have to pass on explaining why. But yes, the answer is they are very interested in creative options. And that's my nature. I'm a creative person in terms of coming up with things like the terrorism or the Kim Jong-il soap opera. Sir.
Could you talk a little bit about, let's say we accept the fact that North Korea is a nuclear power, and now some kind of a deal has to be put together with China and the United States, at least. What would such a deal look like?
That's a really excellent question, one which really requires some serious study. You know, first of all, you've got to come up with something that he's going to get relative to what you're asking him to give up. We haven't created that yet. We have not put on the table, made him pay things, because he's constantly making us pay prices, whether it's through his nuclear tests, his missile tests, whatever. We are not counterparting that, but we could. And so we would have to do that. Second thing is, we've got to ask, what's our objective? Is denuclearization our objective? Probably not going to get there. So are we going to ask him simply to freeze his program, no more production, but keep what he's got now? I'm a little uneasy with that. I don't think that's the answer. I would argue that we ought to set a level of acceptability of North Korean nuclear force, probably lower than where he is now. And President Trump and the administration have been constantly saying, we want him to demonstrate his willingness to meaningfully negotiate. I would ask North Korea, turn to the International Atomic Energy Agency, part of the UN, give them 5 nuclear weapons. Because then you'd be demonstrating you're prepared to deal on nuclear weapons. And here's what you get. If those are real nuclear weapons that could really work and they are fully miniaturized so they could go on a ballistic missile, the IAEA, this body, will say North Korea's got real nuclear weapons. I'd rather let the UN say that, because then North Korea would silence a lot of their critics. But I'd love to have them give up 5 weapons so we can see what's in them and how they work and how we might counter them. So the intelligence gain on that would be tremendous. It would also set a precedent that we could indeed get them to give up something as part of a negotiation. So that's the kind of thing that I would be asking for North Korea to do.
Do we have any way to reach the? I'm here.
Oh,
do we
sorry.
have? Yeah. Do we have any way to have any contact with the North Korean capitalists, the people that you think that possibly from inside might be able to wield some influence for their own benefit?
Yeah, as I understand it, we have a couple of governments that have embassies in Pyongyang that represent U.S. interests when needed. But the common path we usually see taken, as I understand it, is through the UN delegation at the United Nations. So we go up, we have someone go up and talk to their UN delegates and give them a message, and they somehow communicate it back to Pyongyang. That's the common path as I understand it.
You indicated that Russia seems to be behind the technological support for all these improvements and advancements. I never heard being mentioned that to bring Russia into somehow the control or negotiation to help resolve these different conflicts. Could you speak on that, please?
Sure. Many of you will remember the 6 party talks Six-party talks were the nuclear talks that were particularly active in the roughly 2004 to 2007 timeframe. Six parties were North Korea, South Korea, China, Russia, Japan, and the U.S. So Russia was a part of that process. So Russia could potentially play. The problem is much of the help that Russia provided is historical. So North Korea wanted to develop nuclear weapons. They went to Russia, they said, give us some nuclear weapons. In the 50s, Russia said no. They then said, well, then train some of our nuclear engineers. Russia said no. Give us a nuclear power plant. Russia said no. But then in the 60s, Russia gave in and built a research reactor in North Korea. They also began training North Korean scientists as nuclear engineers, not to build a nuclear weapon, but to build a nuclear plant and be able to run it. They trained, as I understand it, about 100 North Korean nuclear engineers in the 60s and 70s. Then in the early 90s, after the end of the Cold War, there were apparently several occasions when North Korea tried to buy size-wise a plane load of Russian scientists. Many of the Russian scientists in missiles, nuclear weapons, and so forth lost their jobs after the end of the Cold War. They were up for sale to anybody who was prepared to pay them a reasonable salary. And the U.S. went in with some of our programs and tried to keep those people employed, but at least in some cases, as I understand it, the North Koreans beat us to the punch with some of their scientists. Whether they are continuing to do that or not, I don't know, but I intend to explore.
As I understand it, okay, as I understand it, they have about 10,000 hardened artillery pieces within range of Seoul. Do they believe that they could conventionally overrun South Korea, number one? Number two, if they did attempt non-nuclear aggression against the South, what would be the reaction of the U.S.?
Yeah. Okay, so North Korea has ballpark about 14,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers, which you launch a rocket rather than an artillery shell. About half of those are along the demilitarized zone, half of them are a defense in depth as you get to Pyongyang, and some up on the Chinese border and in other places. So ballpark about 7,000 or so along the demilitarized zone, a good fraction of those within range of Seoul. We have always been concerned about that artillery. Our main concern has been, even in the 90s, if we tried to shut down their nuclear program, when we had the big debate in '93 over their program, we were afraid that if we took military action against North Korea, they'd just open up artillery onto Seoul, and it would cause so much damage that, you know, it's just we weren't ready to do that. So that's been a historical concern. Could they penetrate the South Korean defenses? We don't really know. We don't know how good that artillery is. Let me give you an example. You remember in 2010, North Korea fired artillery at a South Korean island called Yeonpyeong. Based upon what we know of the artillery that fired, as best I can tell, they should have fired 300 to 400 rounds of artillery. As best we can tell, only about 170 of them were observed in the air. Only half got in the air? That's pretty lousy performance. Only 80 of those hit the island. This is about a 4 square kilometer island at ideal artillery range. They shouldn't have missed with anything near that amount. Only about 60 out of the 80 that hit the island actually exploded. So their actual reliability was about 15 to 20% from what we can tell. We don't know if that's true of the rest of their artillery or whether this was just some old stuff that for whatever reason they chose to use. But that's a piece of propaganda we ought to be using into North Korea. The defectors tell me you want to cause schism in North Korea, you do that on the interface between the regime and the military. So tell the military, we think you did so poorly in that attack on the island because the regime didn't give you good artillery, because it's not the military that develops their artillery, it's a different ministry. They gave you poor shells and rockets, they didn't give you enough training. Those are the likely reasons you didn't perform very well. Sounds like the regime doesn't support you very well. And I'd love to start cracking the cohesion of their military forces. If we ever have to fight, I don't want to have to fight every one of those soldiers all the way through the country.
Could you speak on how North Korea finances its own military and nuclear programs, please?
Yeah, we don't fully know, but one of the big ways they make money is an organization called Office 39. Office 39 is a bit of a misnomer. This is an organization with about 800,000 employees. They run coal mines, they run gold mines, they run iron mines, they run all kinds of business in the region. Every one of their people are supposed to be trying to make money for the regime. And so one of the defectors I deal with was an Office 39 senior employee in China. He was tasked with providing the regime personally from the profit he was individually making $50,000 a year. He provided them at least twice that much to gain favor with the regime. So he was providing, and this was a really good businessman. So they get money in that kind of way. The regime has amassed, we believe, something in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 billion, probably out of money they've skimmed off of taxes, off of Office 39, and other sources. They do a lot of extortion. Their hackers have stolen tens of millions of dollars from overseas banks. So a lot of those kinds of things too. So those are the kinds of things that go into, and of course, some of our counterparts in the world like China do extend foreign credit to the North Koreans. So the trade deficit that North Korea runs with China is substantial. Not as big as our trade deficit with China, but it's still a big deficit relative to what they get. So all of that contributes. Sir.
Can you give us your take on what's going on at the Olympics and the plans for talks between North and South Korea and what that means for us and our relationship with South Korea?
Sure. As you look at the situation in South Korea, what's happening? Well, what's happened is the South Korean president, his #1 objective is peaceful coexistence with the North. He has a Ministry of Unification, and now their main publication is about peaceful coexistence. So not really talking about unification anymore from a South Korean perspective. That's what he wants, and when Kim Jongun, the leader of North Korea, volunteered in his January 1st speech to send his people to the Olympics, South Korean president was tickled pink. And, you know, agreed to pay for everything, have them come, have them bring major propaganda groups to sing and to play in South Korea, which, of course, you got to remember, they're not singing the Star-Spangled Banner. They are singing the North Korean counterparts, very heavily propagandized. There is this. Many people in South Korea have referred to the Pyeongchang Olympics as being the Pyongyang Olympics. In fact, there's a great clip I saw yesterday of NBC broadcasting the Olympics because they had the broadcast rights, and at one point it shows Pyeongchang, North Korea, which is, of course, a location well in South Korea. So even NBC got it wrong. North Korea is eating this up like crazy. Kim Jong-un loves press exposure. I mean, this demonstrates that he's a god. I mean, after all, God should get press exposure. So he's loving this and everything that's happening with his sister being so very popular. I've been asked by a lot of media people, well, didn't Vice President Pence do a terrible job in not talking with the North Koreans? You have to remember, a couple of days before any of the North Korean senior delegation got to South Korea, they said, under no condition will we talk with the Americans at the Olympics. We're not going to do it. No way. Keep away. So what? Vice President Pence is going to go up to the North Koreans and beg them to talk with him? No, he should have said, look, the North Koreans told us they weren't going to talk with us. And so, you know, if my neighbor slams his door in my face, I'm not going to keep banging on the door saying, let me in. The North would love that because they'd say, well, see, the Americans really, they're begging us to negotiate, which is what they would do. So that's some of the politics going on there. The South Korean president hopes this is going to lead to negotiations. But what are you going to negotiate about when we haven't decided what we want and the North Koreans have said we're not going to give you what you want, which is denuclearization? Well, I probably need to call a halt to this. If a couple of you want to stay around afterwards, I'd be happy to talk.